Yeah, your name is Moreno.
I guess so. Anyway, for those of you who are a bit younger than I am, I wanted to start by giving you a little background. Physicians for Human Rights has been used in medicine and science to document human rights violations since 1986. While we do what we can as human rights officers, physicians, scientists, and other health professionals possess a different set of skills that lend tremendous credibility to the investigation and documentation of human rights abuses. In particular, PHR's specialized expertise includes the use of forensic documentation to hold those who violate human rights accountable. We are very fortunate here today to have Stefan Schmidt join us to talk to you more about the collection of credible evidence and data that can be used to corroborate allegations, not only to prevent future abuses, but also to ensure the prosecution of prosecutors by courts, tribunals, and truth commissions. Stefan, on behalf of all my colleagues here today, we would like to thank you for your generous and invaluable support to this training workshop. And now I'll turn it over to Moreno.
Thanks so much, Stefan, to be here. I know that you're coming from a difficult mission in the field, so we are very grateful for your generous, as usual, availability. The person who just you met, our officer in charge, Theodore Reichenbach, and this is the Human Rights Division, or at least the group representing the Human Rights Division here in Juba. We are all waving at you. And please, you can start. I think that we want to take each and every minute of your time. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and I'm really, really happy and glad to be on here. Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. I think that sums up pretty well in a few sentences what PHR does. As for myself, I'm the director of Physicians for Human Rights International Forensics Program, and I've known Morena since 2006, I think, when she was in Afghanistan. And we started confronting some of the issues in regards to documenting mass graves and how to document that in a proper way. We've obviously come a long way, so I'm really, really delighted to be on here with you and with all the staff from the Human Rights Unit. Thanks very much for taking the time. So my background is I'm not a physician, so I'm not a medical doctor. My background actually is in forensic anthropology and in crime scene. I've worked in Guatemala back in the 90s. I've worked with the ICTY and ICTR, helping to establish the exhumations that took part there under the organization of PHR. And in general, the forensic program, we do death investigations. We go into human identification efforts in conflict zones, and not as a provider, meaning that we don't provide human identifications, but as somebody that goes in and tries to establish such efforts on the ground there for us from a sustainable perspective. And then, of course, transitional justice and forensic science are a core part of the work that we do. Now, I think that what makes forensics in the world of human rights and in the world of international documentation and in conflict zones very unique, and that is unlike anything that you have in a national jurisdiction, is the fact that oftentimes as a human rights documenter or as journalists or anybody who comes upon evidence, quote-unquote evidence of mass atrocities or, you know, suspected evidence of such crimes, that you don't really have jurisdiction, meaning that there is nobody there that has given you the mandate in order to collect evidence for a trial. Oftentimes you don't even know if there are ever going to be any trials. So, case in point being, for instance, Syria. So the question really is what do you do then in that case, and how do you collect or document evidence in such a way that at some point in the future it'll stand up to the scrutiny of a court of law. And this is what the presentation I'm giving here is going to be about. So I'm going to be talking about start off with some very basic definitions of what evidence is, chain of custody, and then get into the forensic documentation methods. And when I say forensic documentation methods, it's very important to keep in mind that this consists of digital photography, your handwritten notes, and sketches and measurements. It's based on the principles of science of how data is collected and how it is documented in such a way that it can be scrutinized sometime down the road by your peers. Oops. So forensics, basically the definition is that it's the application of science in a legal setting, and that's a very broad definition, but certainly means that you have to have some sort of mandate / jurisdiction in order to apply the science. So the science obviously is the scientific method, and the point is that you're trying to resolve legal issues or questions. So where is evidence used? And this is very important because everybody, and I'm sure that over the last 2 days that you've been at the workshop, you've all talked about evidence of this and evidence of the other, and especially human rights organizations, including PHR, and journalists use that term very lightly, and it's not always clear what it actually means. So for one thing is there's the very vague notion of what evidence is, and I kind of say that this is evidence in the court of public opinion. Okay, such as a journalist reporting saying this is evidence of this, that, and the other, or in advocacy efforts where evidence is cited in order to highlight a certain violation, let's say. And that, I'd say, you could call the court of public opinion. Then you have evidence that's used in truth commissions or commissions of inquiry, and finally in the courts of law. Now, courts of law have different standards of evidence, meaning that there's different standards to which are applied in order to admit evidence into that particular court of law. So you got customary courts, national courts, and international courts, and the standards of evidence vary by court. So evidence in regards to courts of law is anything that is legally submitted to a competent tribunal as a means of determining the truth of any alleged matter of fact under investigation before it. So important here is that is the legally submitted, meaning that the evidence isn't contested as being illegal or as having been collected in an improper way, or not without a jurisdiction, for instance. Competent tribunal obviously also goes towards the whole issue of jurisdiction, meaning that it's a tribunal that's competent to look at these things. So, legal arguments for or against a certain ruling is made on the basis of evidence by, the prosecutor, the defense, and the judge, depending on what kind of court system you're in. So, court admissibility, though, and that seems to be fairly standard, goes back to being able to demonstrate that you have a chain of custody, okay, being able to show that you've done your best in order to preserve the evidence and protect the evidence from, let's say, degrading or from being contaminated. So the purpose of a chain of custody is to demonstrate that a particular piece of evidence is related to a specific event. Okay, so that's the purpose. Okay, and chain of custody is established through a chronological documentation of custody, of who has been in custody of the evidence throughout its life. And the most important part is that the chain of custody begins with the discovery or the identification of that particular piece of evidence by an identifiable person or individual, and that records then chronologically the individuals involved in the collection, seizure, custody, transfer, and disposition of the evidence. Disposition meaning where the evidence ends up. So we want to be able to document where the evidence originated. And that means location, that means date and time, that means what person identified the evidence, or and which person was the person that seized or documented the evidence. So the fundamental concepts behind custody, chain of custody, are first off authentication. As somebody who's documenting evidence, okay, you have to be able to prove that the evidence is real, okay, meaning that it actually exists. Okay, it's a real piece of evidence. It wasn't manufactured in China or, you know, something to the effect, or manipulated. And then the verification part, which is, can it be checked that it is real? Okay, so there are several levels of authenticating and verifying evidence, in the sense that when you collect or document evidence, you have to be able to always think back to, okay, how are we going to prove that this is actually real, that this exists, and how can it be checked that it is real? So the authentication is something that happens through being able to identify the point of origin. Where did this particular piece of origin of evidence originate? Okay, where does it come from? The person collecting and or seizing the evidence, and the time and location that was collected. And this type of verification, the verification part, okay, checking whether it's real. Hold on a second, let's go back. Checking whether it's real is done, generally speaking, through standardized procedures, meaning that there's a rule book somewhere, procedures and protocol, that lays out exactly how records are kept, how chain of custody is kept, and the credibility. What this does is that it gives the evidence and the person that collected the evidence the credibility they need in order to stand up in court through something which I call reliable record keeping. So all of that is basically a bundle in order to enhance the credibility of the evidence that you have collected or documented to a point where it'll stand up in court, or hopefully stand up in court. I mean, you never know until you go to the judge. So the way this is done, and this is what is relevant to you and the work that you do out in the field, is that I realize that the United Nations doesn't have standard, protocols and procedures for how to collect data, how that data is stored, for things like chain of custody, things of that nature, and that's not what I would expect. And that's the whole reason why I'm talking to you, because I'm trying to kind of show you a way to do this on your own, so that the evidence that you document and the data that you collect will hold up in court and is credible. Now, one caveat here is that I understand, and I am going under the assumption that you cannot collect evidence, meaning that if you go out onto the field, you can't just collect cartridge casings from, a massacre, because you simply don't have the jurisdiction to do so. Okay? So I am focusing here on, well, if you can't collect the actual piece of physical evidence, then, how do you go about documenting it? And forensic documentation effectively is threefold. It starts with your notes, your handwritten notes. So handwritten notes are something very important. I know that a lot of people, they take their handwritten notes and then they go ahead and type it out. But the truth of it is that your handwritten notes that you do in the field show where the documentation happened, what your thoughts were at the time, is something that, you know, comes from an original source that is in your handwriting, so that if you do sit in court at some point and somebody says, well, do you recognize, and you can say, yeah, this is my handwriting. The next part is, and that doesn't seem too intuitive to most people, but you want to have sketches in which you have measurements and possibly the use of diagrams. And by that I mean that if you come out to a crime scene, and let's just imagine this is a warehouse somewhere on the outskirts of whatever town, sitting within a compound, and within that warehouse you have 30 people who have been summarily executed and are laying on the ground. Now, obviously, the first thing that people think about is, okay, yeah, we're going to take photographs, and the photographs will document what we have here. That is true, but it's also important that you actually make a sketch of that compound, and that you take measurements of, you know, how wide is the door, for instance, you know, how big is the warehouse in and of itself, because all that corroborates what you get to see in the photograph and what's written in your notes. So sketches are an important part of the work that you do, especially distances through photographs oftentimes or sometimes can't be viewed very well, and they're certainly not accurate. So it's more accurate to go ahead and do measurements. And I found just for myself, after doing this for many years, that often it's easier to just recur back to your sketch, okay, in order to understand what the scene actually looked like and what the dimensions were, and how far was this body laying from the other body, things of that nature. And then finally, obviously, it's the digital photographs and sometimes video. I prefer digital photographs because digital photograph resolutions are much higher than what you get even in some of the high resolution, high definition video that we have today, and I'll get into that a little later. So the important part here is that you do consistent cross-referencing, meaning that in your notes you start with, okay, I arrived, at the warehouse, at such and such a time, accompanied by X, Y, and Z, and we met with witness, ABC, and he gave us, this story here, and you can write it all down, and then you can say, okay, I'm, going to start taking photographs now. Put your time down when you do that. So it kind of keeps a very good record of what it is that you're doing. It's similar to, I remember, consulting with Morena and the UN. In general, you have to hand in a list of all the meetings that you've done and what times they were done. So it's kind of something to that effect. It gives credibility towards what you're doing. And you have to remember that your photographs all also end up having a digital timestamp, okay, date and timestamp. So all that will help you corroborate what it is that you're writing in your notes. So as a case example, and let me see if I can get this to work now. Let's see. This is can everybody see this?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, so this actually was an exhumation that I did in Afghanistan at the Ministry of Interior. They're in a compound. So, this is the actual written report. So obviously nowadays with Google Earth you can easily, screen capture something and print it out. But here are some of the photographs that that kind of depict the scene. Okay. And here's another one. So another thing that is very helpful is the use of photo markers in your photographs. And I realize that not everybody walks around with crime scene photo markers, but these are easily manufactured. I have used pencils and those little sticky notes in order to do that. And sometimes that's very helpful. For instance, if you have a pile of bodies in photographs sometimes it's not very easy to distinguish how many bodies you have or how many heads are in that pile. So with something like that, you know, that sometimes can be helpful in order to distinguish those kind of things. Now obviously these are not all the photographs that were taken. And here you have the sketch. Actually this is the diagram that was made on the basis of the CAD drawing made on the basis of the sketch that was taken. And and in order to show you a little bit how this works, here are the notes that I took, and you can see as a Ministry of Interior exhumation, and this is our case number. I always have a case number for it, the date, and you know, a time right here when, you know, when we arrived at the site and what people were with us. So it says here, took overall photographs, you know, started a trench, you know, the photo markers number 7 and 8, you know, started uncovering a skull, and so on and so forth. And you can see this is actually my hand-drawn sketch that, you know, I made a CAD drawing for in CAD. Okay, so all this, what this does is it gives credibility to the information in the report. And if it, you know, comes to the day that, you know, something like this would go to court, then let me get back to my PowerPoint. So when it comes to a report, you have all the notes that, you know, consistently cross-reference between the notes, the sketches, and the photographs. Now, what's important is that, you know, you give your case a unique identifier, a case number, something like that. It's important to have your notes handwritten, to always record the date and time, and to signature or initial each and every page, and put down, you know, what page numbers you have, so that nobody can say, okay, pages have gone missing. The same goes for sketches. You know, you want to do the same thing. You want to make sure that you consistently put down your case identifier, date and time, initial signature, north arrow, very important. You want to be able to indicate where is north. Put down an index of the items that were sketched, or the photo markers. And for me, when I go ahead and take these notes, the photo markers are going to be documented and listed or indexed in the notes. They'll be in the sketch, and obviously they're going to be in the photograph. So all that kind of helps tie all this together. So now the big question is how do digital images play into the documentation? And it really is a big cornerstone, because nowadays with digital photographs you capture so much. First off, you're not really limited by how many photographs you can take. So unlike the olden days where you had 36 photographs per roll of film, now you can take hundreds if not thousands of photographs any which way you please. And I remember, you know, when I started working in crime scene, we still had to do photo logs of photographs taken on negative film. And nowadays digital photographs record something called metadata or EXIF data, and all that data actually is very helpful in putting together photo logs, and we'll get into that. So as to resolution, here's some of the different resolutions that you have. So a Nikon D800, which is an older Nikon digital camera, but effectively gives you about 36 megapixels per image. An iPhone 6 camera gives you about 8 megapixels, and HD video gives you about 2 megapixels per image. So HD video will take 30 or more frames per second. Each frame is going to be around 2 megapixels, and now they have 4K video, which is going to be a little more, but it's still not anywhere close to what digital cameras can do. So as an example, and I have kept this slide, as you can see, for many years, because this was a photograph taken with a Nikon D1. That was the first Nikon digital camera that came out, which had 2.7 megapixels, which was unimaginable for the day back then. And now every iPhone or every cell phone takes higher resolution photographs. But this is an aerial photograph of actually the airport here in Tallahassee, where I live. And what I've done is I've taken that little area down here and I've kind of enlarged it up here in this corner. See the red pickup right here, and that's the red pickup down here. Now what's very important to remember is that digital resolution becomes crucial in photographs like this, because if you look a little closer, you'll all of a sudden see that the trees are blurry. And the reason why is that all of a sudden, you know, you only have 1 or 2 pixels or 1 or 2 dots on the chip of the camera that has to that captures data of, you know, of an entire branch rather than an entire leaf. So everything starts becoming a little blurry. So here's a negative photograph, okay, and you can actually see here that the resolution is much better. You can actually see the individual bushes and leaves and what have you. And generally speaking, the rule of thumb is that negative photographs, and nobody uses that anymore, obviously, but are about 14 to, you know, equivalent to that in a digital camera is 14 to 20 megapixels, which most digital cameras will do today. So, like I said, one important tool that assists you in documenting the work that you do is your camera. So it's very important, and even if that is your iPhone, okay, it doesn't really, you know, in that sense it doesn't matter. First rule is really make sure you set your date and time so that it correlates with your notes, or or at least correlates with a standard time, be it GMT or something to that effect. Second, make sure that the photographs that you take, when you take them, that they are labeled sequentially. Okay, so photograph, you know, 1 through whatever, and that it doesn't reset. So you don't end up with, you know, over a period of years, you end up with, you know, number 50 files, because you've you know, every time you restarted your camera, it restarted the numbering. Another very important point is that you want to make sure that you do not delete photographs that didn't work out. It's very important that, you know, even if you take, you know, if you're going around somewhere and you accidentally hit the camera button and you end up having, you know, your foot in the picture, or something that, you know, is not really relevant to the whole thing, it's better to leave that in your sequence, simply because if you delete it, then all of a sudden you might be asked, you know, in a court of law at some point, well, where's photograph number 49? And you know, it gives rise to suspicions that are not useful. Now, I don't know as to how many of you are avid photographers, but another very important factor here, and that really works almost only with cameras that are, you know, professional, or consumer grade professional cameras, is that if you can, you should take your photographs in RAW format, meaning in the format where there is no compression at all. JPEG formats, which is what your smartphone and your average digital camera takes, are all compressed images, meaning that the computer inside the camera has already compressed the image and thrown out a whole bundle of data it seemed as not worthy of keeping. Okay, so JPEGs obviously are smaller files, have less information. There's less detail in them than in raw photographs. Now, most cameras like SLR cameras, like Nikon's or Canon's, will allow you to take raw photographs, uncompressed images, along with a JPEG image. Now, so things like TIFF images and RAW images, and then there's proprietary formats like Nikon's RAW images, NIF, are good. And a very important thing to keep in mind that if you only take JPEG photographs, let's say through your smartphone or just simply because of your camera, that's all it does, is that every time you open the file and then save it somewhere else, okay, possibly under a new name, the compression algorithm, the formula that your computer uses in order to compress that image, is different every time, so it's not consistent. So I challenge you just to take an image on your laptop or hard drive, open it up, rename it to 1. Open that one up, rename it, and save it as 2. Do that 50 times, and you will see that from the original image to the one of the 50th iteration, the quality of your image has severely degraded. Okay, so another thing that has to be that you have to think about when you use digital images for documenting possible evidence of atrocities is the way you store and handle your photographs. Okay, so you want to make sure that even if you have JPEG images, that you have a place where those original images directly came from the camera and are stored and haven't been touched, as in opened or saved or resaved or something to the effect. Okay, here's, I don't know if you can see that. Here's, for instance, is a raw image, the top one, and the bottom one is a JPEG image. And I don't know, can you see these blocky artifacts where the image is a little blocky? Is that visible?
Yes.
Okay, and that for instance, that blocky feature is an artifact that happens through JPEG compression. So effectively, you lose information. Like, on the top one, you can actually, see the pupil here, and down here it's just become a mishmash of things. So that's kind of like an example of how that goes. So, labeling, as I had mentioned, is labeling. I like doing that, and it's important in your photographs so that 20 years from down the road, you don't have to look at a photograph and think, "Now, I don't know why I took this photograph." When in truth is if you would put down a label, A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3, or whichever it is, in a certain place in that photograph, then it would be clear what it is that you want to draw attention to in that particular photograph. And those things, and labels can be cross-referenced again in the notes in the sketch. So another important facet is the way you go about taking your photographs. And there's a certain sequence to it. There's a routine to it. Okay, I know that most people, when they take photographs, I mean, I know it just because I get photographs from investigators around the world. And one interesting feature is that oftentimes they take photographs, they send them to me, and don't realize that I just get the photograph, but their image of that photograph is much bigger in their mind, meaning they add a whole lot of other information to that particular photograph just because they were out at that place, without realizing that that's done. So a singular image doesn't help. And I'll give you an example. This was a case in Turkey, and supposedly somebody had found a mass grave relative to the Armenian genocide in Turkey. And so I get a photograph of what looked like a grassy hole in the ground to me. And I'm thinking, wow, that looks interesting. I had no idea how big or anything, what this actually was. And it wasn't until several days later that I get a series of photographs, and I finally realized, oh, this is not a hole in the ground, but rather a cave opening, okay, with some bushes around it rather than just grass. So it kind of shows you what happens when you just have photographs that are taken out of context. So again, going back to the whole idea of sequential numbering and all this other stuff, date and times, the general rule is you start with your overall photograph. Identify what is the scene that you want to depict, okay? And the scene could be a house. So you want to do the overall photographs of the house, meaning that, you know, take pictures going around the house, depicting all sides of the house before you start delving into what it is you want to do next. And if, you know, I mean, like in Afghanistan, I've had cases where, where there's a mass grave in a valley, and my overall photographs I actually ended up doing from the mountainside around it in order to document nicely what the scene, the area of the scene is. So the next one are the medium range photographs. And medium range photographs, I mean those photographs that show the relationship between particular pieces or items of evidence between each other. So let's say you're talking about a field or let's say a parking lot, and you have 5 bodies laying in that parking lot. So it's going to be important to be able to establish the spatial relationships between these bodies. You might not be able to take one photograph with all 5 bodies in it, but you can take photographs with 2 or 3 bodies in one picture, and then the next picture is going to be overlapped with one body and the other 2 bodies that you were looking for. So it kind of establishes a relationship between the pieces of evidence. And then finally, the close-ups are the ones that you want to take photographs of that are going to be useful in order to look at specific details of evidence. So let's say cartridge casing. If you have, for instance, between the 5 bodies, you have 6 cartridge casings on the ground, you might want to take medium range photographs which show the distribution of the cartridge casings over 3 or 4 photographs. And obviously what you can't see in there is the detail as to, you know, what kind of cartridge casings these are. So the close-up photographs are the ones that are important in order to document those kind of details. So general rule is make sure that you fill the frame with whatever it is that you want to take. So don't take a photograph where the cartridge casing is only 10% of the photograph, but you want to make sure that you fill the frame and get as much detail as you can. And this is something that is important for taking measurements, is important for experts to be able to review it. You know, you might be able to determine what kind of cartridge casing or what kind of caliber gun this might have belonged to, those kind of things. So, so the sequence in which this is taken is start off with your overall photographs, next go to your medium range photographs, and finally do your close-up photographs. And this is really something that when I teach a class on this kind of thing, we actually go through several practical exercises in order to kind of get that idea to the point where it really becomes routine. You shouldn't really think about anything other than what is my scene, and then start with, okay, I'm going to do overall photographs. Do your overall photographs. Next step, do your medium range photographs, and finally do your close-up photographs. So, important part. Again, if you can include photo markers, I definitely prefer that. Include a scale. Very important is to include a scale in your photographs. Now, I realize not everybody carries a scale in their back pocket, but alternatively, you can now actually print out scales from the internet. That can be helpful. Or you can use just something that is of a known size. So a coin, or even a bill of money, or something that you know the size of to have in the picture. Here are some examples of scales. And another important facet for forensic photography is that not only do you want to be able to control for the dimensions in the photographs by having a scale with 1 centimeters or whatever, what have you, but you also need to be able to control for the color. As you've noticed, if you take photographs in a room that has fluorescent lighting, your colors are going to be off. So they're going to be a little yellowish, or people end up having, an oranges type of hepatitis B tinge to their to their skin. And the way that gets controlled is through something called white balance, and this is where known colors come in important. And these scales here, for instance, this is neutral white, this is a neutral gray, and this is a known yellow, and those things can all be used in order to control for discoloration in the photograph. So down the road, and this is something important, for instance, when you're taking photographs of bruises of people. Okay, so if you are trying to document somebody who's been tortured, if at all possible, try to do it under natural light. Okay, if you can't do it under natural light, try to use your flash. Your flash usually helps with the white balance. And if you're an avid photographer and proficient with it, and you have a good camera, then you can control the white balance by using some, by calibrating it against a known color, such as a white sheet of paper. You can say, okay, this is a white sheet of paper. The camera will adjust the colors accordingly. But that's a very important thing to think about when you're taking photographs, especially of things like bruises, because bruises change color, which might be an indication of how old that particular injury is. And if you don't get the colors right, then it's very hard to say anything at all. Yeah, close up, we went through that. Yeah, photography in general, like I said, higher resolution than video. Another thing also is the embedded information, the metadata in the photographs. That metadata, depending on what kind of camera you're using, can have anything, well, date and time in it, the file name, what kind of camera was used. It can have GPS information in it if your camera is capable of recording GPS coordinates, which is another big plus, because that can give you even more credibility as to where exactly you were. Another thing is that photographs, because you're doing this as a sequence, allow for the review of the evidence that you've documented to go back and forth and look at these things, whereas video is a very linear process. So video is also always going to be something that I would say is secondary to photography. Okay. So one thing that I recommend, and I'm going to end with this here, I think. I don't know how our time is going. Okay. Is that how do you manage your photographs that you've taken? Okay. So there are certain considerations. One thing is that you want to minimize any possibility that the photographs are unreliable as a source of documentation and information, which means that you need to maximize the control over the handling of the photographs. Okay. And again, just as a reminder to the chain of custody thing, is that we have to authenticate the evidence through identifying the point of origin, the person that collected or receives the evidence, and the time that it was collected. And in that respect, photographs, your notes, and your sketches can become evidence in and of themselves. Okay. So for one thing is the photo log. Okay, which is keeping a log of the photographs. Now, the way that I deal with that nowadays is that once I have my sequence of photographs, I go ahead and extract, and there's different software packages that'll do it for you, but I extract the metadata from the images, or I don't extract it as in take it away, but I basically put it into a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet will give me the file names, will give me the dates and times the photographs were taken, and I can put comments in one column as to what this was. So generally I say photographs 1 through 30, overall photographs of the scene. Then step 2 is you want to transfer the digital images to a secure type of media. Okay, and third is how do you store it? And those are all things that you ought to decide for yourselves before you actually do it. Meaning that because the UN doesn't have standardized procedures on how to handle digital images that are taken of possible atrocities, you kind of have to decide for yourself what's going to be your protocol. So your protocol could be, for instance, that you transfer your images to, and I used to recommend to burn them to DVD. I don't do that anymore because USB sticks have gotten so cheap. So I kind of say, okay, well, just transfer them to a USB stick. Lock the USB stick so it can't be overwritten, and seal that in an envelope, just like a physical piece of evidence, and lock it away in whatever designate drawer you might have at your desk. And the good thing about digital images is that obviously for the purposes of you writing a report, you can make copies of the images that you have and use them on your computer for whatever report writing or whatever purposes that you want. The important part is that you have somewhere documented a copy, not a copy, a master archive it's actually called, of the images themselves. So here's a little bit about the photo log, and again, the photo log for me is something that goes along in the report, along with a contact sheet, meaning it's basically a sheet with all the thumbnails of the images that are on there, so that a prosecutor or whomever, even you yourself or investigator, can go through the little thumbnail images before calling up the big ones and looking at them specifically. So the photo log is something as helps cross-reference as to what you have taken, what photographs were taken, where you took them, and it's all cross-referenced again in your notes in your sketch. So the EXIF is exchangeable image file format for storing metadata about file name, etc. Like I said, the software that I use is something called BF's EXIF Extractor, and you can search for that on the internet. It's a very easy to use piece of software that will extract EXIF information / metadata from images in a folder and put them into a spreadsheet. Useful little thing. Like I said, I before would say, okay, and that's what I used to do, is burn burn the images from the digital camera or the chip directly to a DVD, preferably even without using a computer. So I actually had DVD burners where you just stuck the chip in and it would automatically burn to the DVD. And I would refer to that archive or that DVD as the master archive, meaning that that's the master archive with all the original images on it. Okay. Anything else that's not labeled as such isn't that. Okay. This is an example of it. Now, obviously today, with USB sticks becoming so cheap, it might even be better and longer lasting, because these DVDs only last, I think, like 50 years or less, to store your images on a USB stick or on a hard drive. Just have something that you, as a standard, use and you can document and say, okay, yeah, these are all my original images. I do not touch these after I've put them on here. Anything that I want to use, I make a second copy of, and then I use that. So that's basically it. So yeah. So I'm not going to get into this, I think, which is torture victim documentation. But just to put a couple of words in for that, you know, torture victim documentation is pretty much the same thing. Okay, you have your diagrams, body diagrams, you have your overall medium range close-up photographs, and you have your handwritten notes. So the principles of forensic documentation apply here equally in that. So with the difference that, you know, you're seen as just one body. All right, I don't know. Anybody have any questions?
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you
just
so
can't see
much. You can even see me?
No.
I know, I turned it off because if not it was disturbed. Okay, I can see me, but you can. Let me check here. Sorry, you know me, I'm not very technological.
What?
It's okay. Let's check if you can see me now, but I don't want to disturb the audio. That is much more important. Thanks so much, Stefan. We understand that you were targeting mainly on photos because here, as you rightly said, we do not have jurisdictional power. And it's very hard for us to document without affecting the future justice process or future trials in case we come across to atrocities or evidence of atrocities. My question is, I want to just to take advantage of you, and can you also give us some very important do not do, mainly in the case of mass graves? Here in South Sudan, we are dealing with mass graves. We do not at the moment have the capacity many times to do much about that. And we do not have the capacity to properly protect sometimes. So we can end up being able to reach one location and to leave, and we are not able to give the necessary scrutiny and protection that we perhaps were able to give in Afghanistan. So can we just clarify some very important do and do not in case of the mass graves as an important takeaway for us, and this is something I would like you to share, and then the floor is with the colleagues, of course. Thank you.
Yeah, in regards to mass graves, the difficulty and the challenge on a mass grave is that by the time you get there, you call it a grave because the bodies are underground. You don't get to see the bodies anymore. So you don't really know whether what you're looking at is evidence of a mass grave or not, depending on what it is that you get to see. So do take, again, good photographs, because disturbance of soil might be an indication of that, you have a mass grave there. Do take photographs of the things that are lying around on the surface, even though in your first instance you might not recognize what relevance, how relevant they are. So take photographs of things that even don't seem to be relevant right off the bat to you. The principles of documentation apply the same as what I gave in my lecture, so there's no difference there. Now, as the do not warning, I think that the biggest problems with mass graves are efforts to uncover them or exhume bodies before the conditions are set in order to be able to deal with it. and then you end up destroying evidence. And that really becomes problematic. And I've seen this over and over again around the world where, you know, there's a lot of political pressure that, you know, these martyrs need to be exhumed and they need to be brought back to, you know, their home soil and buried there. And in the whole process, you end up losing evidence of what really happened, oftentimes even losing evidence of who you're exhuming out of the mass grave. So for me, the do not, and I realize that you're not the ones who are exhuming mass graves, but I know that, you know, you're often the ones who talk to people who want these mass graves exhumed, and that includes families, and who put a lot of pressure on having these mass graves exhumed, is, you know, the mantra or the, you know, the message that needs to go out, even though it's very hard to understand, is the fact that, listen, you know, this, you know, mass graves are a generational issue. You're not going to resolve this problem in a matter of months, or maybe even in a matter of years. And you know, the most important thing is to wait until you try to have all the necessary components in place in order to be able to deal with it. So that's my do not. And it's, you know, the second one is, and as Morena explained, that is, do not collect evidence. I recommend against that. So, you know, collecting cartridge casings and things like that, and you take them out of the scene if you don't have any jurisdiction, that might lead to problems down the road. So that certainly is something that, you know, you need to discuss amongst yourselves on whether you can do it or not. But in cases like that where you can't collect that kind of evidence, it's extremely important that you take good photographs of what you have there. I mean, I've had, you know, testimony. This was in Libya in a warehouse. Testimony of a guy saying that, you know, an officer came around and he carried a 9mm Glock pistol and started shooting people with it. And, you know, I found cartridge casings that have, you know, Glock pistols have very characteristic hammer strike on the end cap of the cartridge, which is a nice little rectangle. It's not a round pin, it's a rectangular type of a hammer that strikes it. And sure enough, I found some 9mm cartridge casings that had that. Now, that doesn't tell me that that was necessarily a Glock, but there's only a handful of guns that have that type of strike pattern, you know, hammer pattern. And it was important to take, you know, photographs that are good enough for that, especially knowing that I wasn't going to collect those cartridge casings. So again, keep in mind that, you know, many of these things can be documented very well by taking good photographs. So I hope that kind of addresses that, Morena.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it's very clear to me. Any other question?
Identification.
What?
Identification.
Identification or remains.
Yes.
But a colleague is asking what on identification of remains of hubris, of human hubris. What exactly?
Okay, so identification, I mean, that in and of itself is a very, very vast and big subject, and can become quite complicated. So first off, you have to realize that, and I've written about this, and this is my opinion on human identifications. First off, human identifications are the responsibility of the state, meaning that it's either responsibility of the country of Afghanistan or South Sudan or wherever it might be, is that the identity of a person. So, for instance, I myself, my name is Stefan Schmidt. Granted, my parents picked and chose that name, but the persons who actually identify me by that is the, you know, is Germany, the country of Germany, okay, which gives me a passport, which gives me a birth certificate, and it gives me certain rights and obligations that come along with that. So in that respect, it's very important to keep in mind that when you try to do identifications of people that come out of a mass grave, that first the identity of these people cannot be given by some outside agency. So, be that, you know, the ICRC or the ICMP or whomever, they can't identify anybody in there, regardless of what their technological capabilities are. Okay? And it's very important to keep in mind that if you use DNA as part of an identification strategy, okay, that DNA work in a certain laboratory should also be under the jurisdiction of whatever country is trying to do these identifications. The problem is that if you take DNA samples and collect them from the family members, that raises expectations in the family members that at some point they're going to get their loved ones back. You take samples from the bodies and then you fly them out of the country in order to do the matching, for instance. If a mistake happens, and mistakes happen in laboratories, that's well, I don't want to say normal, but that's certainly something that happens, and is certainly something that can be dealt with. The problem is if those kind of mistakes happen in a foreign country outside of the jurisdiction of the country that needs the identifications, there is no judicial means by resolving that. Meaning that a misidentification generated by a foreign laboratory is going to create some severe problems on the ground in whatever country that is, which can't be resolved legally just simply because they don't have jurisdiction over it. So, to me, very important when it comes to human identification is to advocate for the establishing of a sustainable human identification effort in that country. So, if Sudan has, I don't know, 150 mass graves with 2,000 people in it, or what have you, just to throw out a number like that, the first realization is that, you know, this is going to take years to resolve. B, that the scientific effort in doing these identifications really is something that needs to be owned by that particular country. And C, that the advocacy should go towards building DNA facilities or a human identification effort in that particular country. And those are all things that are certainly possible. DNA is not the great magical mystical science that is beyond local or national capacity. It's not true. It's just going to take a while to get to the point where it's reliable, and that's where help needs to happen. So I know that this is probably not quite the answer that you expected, but I think that's the most useful one that I can give in such a short time.
Thank you. Any other questions? No other question? Because if not, it's free to go.
I mean, it's the end of the day for you all. I'm sure you've already had a long day, so.
No, it's the end of the day, it's true, and you know, it's not easy to follow on screen. As we all know, it's the end of the day, it's on screen, the room is dark, so it's not that easy, but it was very, very, very interesting, it was absolutely useful, and it was very nice to see you, even if only on screen. We hope that we can have a kind of fancy capacity here to help us and to help the country more than us to come to terms with their past and their present human rights violations. Stefan, would you like to say anything?
I think, Stefan, my name is Stefan too.
Yeah.
Stefan, with
Stefan, but with a PA. I mean, the last point that you made was actually valid in the sense that the element of expertise in whatever we do is important. The reason why we were asking about do's and don'ts, it's because, and you said it in my view, the response was eloquent regarding the advocating as a human rights officer as opposed to being active. You identify, you observe, you advocate for. And for me, it was also an eye-opening exercise. And we hope to be able to have opportunities to ask you other questions that may come even in a different format by sending them to you, if possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, feel free to contact me anytime. I mean, that's what I'm here for.
I appreciate it, very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.